All right, hey folks. So today we are going to go over one of my old bench training cycles, and I thought it'd be cool to check it out and learn from what I did back then. So firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments, pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there's a link in the description. So this was from about, I think like 10 years ago, the first video anyway. And just recently I was doing some tidying up and I found some of my old training diaries. So I was looking through and this came up. So I thought it'd make for a good video. I've got the video footage as well, and I've got the training cycle, so I thought I'd talk you through what I was doing. So firstly, this comes off of some fairly non-specialized training, some sort of general bodybuilding style training. Around about 2007-ish, I injured my hamstring. For a few years after that, I just did some bodybuilding style training where I was just trying to get everything back together. And to be honest, I'd pretty much given up on powerlifting hopes at that stage because my hamstring was in bits. And so I did some bodybuilding for a while. And then eventually through that, I kind of mostly got recovered. In 2010-ish, this is loosely when I sort of hit these, started to develop a good run and get back into powerlifting heavily. And when I reached my biggest numbers was in my early 30s, around about those early 2010, 2013, 14, 15 type of years. So this is from around about then, and I thought it'd be cool to check it out. So firstly, let's have a look at the lifts. So this is the first time I hit, this was 170 because this is what I've got recorded. And here we go. So I was always a really slow bench presser. I never brought it down fast, always quite slow. And I would just sort of, really sort of cushion it down on my back or on my lats and then drive it back up again. So I was always really slow bench presser. And you can see my little celebration here at the end. So that was, that was like the first time I did that bench. And then next is the time I hit this, which was a few years later. At the actual bench part of it. Here we go. Yeah, pretty similar again. A bit more of a struggle this time. A little bit slower, a bit slower on the way up. But yeah, that was pretty cool. So yeah, I thought it'd be nice to have a little bit of a chat about what I did leading up to this. So prior to this run, I'm going to talk mostly about the first time I hit those numbers first, and then I'll talk about the later time, which was a few years after that. And it was more on my sort of strength decline. So I thought it'd make for good content. So yeah, I'd come off mostly a non-specialized bodybuilding style of block, and then everything felt better, hamstring felt good, everything felt good. So I thought I would go back into more heavy lifting. So that's kind of where this happened. All right, so yeah, so the basis of the routine was mostly a full body 3 times a week routine. Now, eventually I ended up lifting more often, and I was doing full body around about 5 to 6 times a week with a variety of light days and also heavier days, which were split up a little bit more. And that's what led to my bigger numbers. And I actually surpassed this bench that you're watching now a couple of times, and I hit 180 a few times. But this is what I did for this to get up to this level of strength. In hindsight, this was pretty good. I did need to push a little bit harder to get the heavier lifts, but ultimately pushing harder led to more injuries as well. So who can say? Anyway, full body 3 times a week was what I did for this. It was round about 2 very heavy days followed by a light day. The light day was sort of sandwiched in between. There wasn't much assistance done, mostly because there wasn't really time to do it. So in one session, I was doing a squat variation and a bench variation and a deadlift variation. So it wasn't just like I was a bench specialist at the time. I was very much into full-on powerlifting. So it was a lot, maxing out on squat, bench, deadlift variations in each session and doing back off work. It's a hell of a lot of work. It gets very tiring. Some of those sessions were absolutely brutal. So and then the light day in the middle would be somewhat of a recovery day, but again, it would be the actual competition lifts this time, just done for light. So light work. If I did do assistance work, it was mostly just chins and curls, mostly because there wasn't much time for much else. So Monday and Friday, this is kind of what it looked like. And yeah, bear in mind, this is the first time that I hit those big numbers. I rotated a variety of different exercises using my 8s, 5s, and 3s approach. So the ones that I mostly stuck with over the course of that sort of couple of years was the close grip bench. I used that probably 60 to 70% of the time. Then I would rotate in things like the incline close grip bench, slingshot bench, floor press, and a feet up bench press. I think in hindsight, I probably would have rotated more often. I don't think I needed to pound away at the close grip bench so much. It was highly productive for me, but it was just, variation is good for the body. It keeps you injury free. So I would work up to a heavy single, and then I would carry on my progression of 8s, 5s, and 3s on that exercise. And that works very well. The 8s, 5s, and 3s, I made a video on 8s, 5s, and 3s, so just search my account. Yeah, as I say, minimal assistance on those days as I was still doing the squat and the deadlift as well. And the Wednesday would look like this. A light day, you could call it a speed day, 6 to 8 triples at 50 to 60%. The idea really there was just to focus on form. You were supposed to lift, explosively, but I never really called it a speed day because, like Westside would, simply because I believed everything should be lifted for speed. So, there was no differentiation. It was just simply the weight on the bar was lighter. But I intended to explode everything, whether it was a max effort or whatever. So that was just a light day. That's what I would call it. So this is basically what my week would look like leading up to those benches. Main variation on the squat, bench, and deadlift, for singles and for back offs. And then if I had the energy, chins and curls. That was Monday and Friday. Wednesday would be a light day. And I would just sort of try and progress up. The top single that I did, it wasn't actually like a all-out single, and I wasn't trying to progress it. It was basically how I felt on the day. So it was what you might call like a daily single, like a Bulgarian daily single. It was mostly based on how I felt on the day. So if I went in and I was feeling really good, I would just try and hit that a little bit heavier. It never affected my rep work. So it's not like I would go heavier on that, and if I felt good on that, I would do more on my rep work. Those two things were run completely independently. The daily single was just simply to stay in touch with lifting heavy weights. And I think there's value in that. If you say you're a powerlifter, you shouldn't shy away from singles in some capacity all year round. They weren't max singles. I wasn't maxing out on those, but they were anywhere in the region of, I would say, 80 to 100%, depending on the day. And then the repetition work would run independently of that, and it would just be based on the 8s, 5s, and 3s. So I would just try and beat what I did last time using a sort of double progression type of method. So yeah, that worked very well. I varied between using different variations on Monday to Friday and not. Initially, I would start and just do the close grip bench press on Monday and Friday. Eventually, when I got too much, I started to implement changes. So I would do the close grip bench on Monday, followed by something like the floor press or the incline close grip bench press or the slingshot bench on Friday. And I would run those cycles independently. So it just provided a bit more variation and less repetitive stress on the joints. And it worked. It was just continued to get me stronger and stronger. In terms of how I would judge my strength, after a while, you can start to find correlations between your different variation lifts and your main lift. So for example, my close grip bench was always about 90% of my actual bench press. My stiff leg deadlift was always about 90% of my actual deadlift. Those variations were highly correlated for me. So I know that if my close grip bench press went up, then my bench would go up. So I would do things to try and increase my close grip bench because it was so highly correlated to my actual bench. So I would do things like an incline close grip bench, and that just made the movement stricter. If that went up, typically my close grip bench would go up, etc., etc. You get the idea. So I approached things from two different avenues. One type of assistance lift helped me to hold the weight. So overloading lifts like the slingshot bench. If I could hold on to and bench, 200 kilos or 190 kilos with a slingshot on, then I was much more likely to be confident with a 170, 180 kilo regular bench. And then the other types of lifts were things which were actually builders and use a lot less weight. So things like the floor press or the feet up bench press. That's a great example. The feet up bench press or the incline close grip bench press, they were always a lot lighter. But if I could build those, then they built the musculature associated with a bigger bench. So I kind of separated those out in two ways in my mind. The types of lifts which were overloading lifts and the other ones which were actually bench builders. They both got a bigger bench, but they were just slightly different ways to differentiate what you were doing in your head. So, but I think ultimately it was the case of finding what variations are correlated for you and then how to improve those variations. Anyway, that was the basis of the first time I hit those big numbers. Now, if we looked at what changed years later, so probably about 5 years later, I hit those sort of big numbers on the other side as my strength was sort of declining. My last hurrah, as it were, was in probably the last time I got decently strong was probably about 5 years ago. And what changed years later was I had a lot more variety in the main variations. So I didn't used to stick to things like the close grip bench for weeks at a time. I would flip flop between those all the time. So it might be close grip bench one week, it might be the feet up bench another week, it might be the slingshot another week, incline close grip bench press another week. I would move those around far more frequently. In terms of the singles, I would still do those because I never found I got that many injuries from the actual like daily max singles or sub max singles. But what I did drop was the 5s and the 3s. As I got older, like on the other side of 35, I consistently found that the 5s and 3s were very injurious. They were very, very difficult to recover from at that strength level. Like nowadays, I'm fine. Like now, if I'm, if I've got just 100 kilo on the bar and I'm benching for 5s, it's fine. It's not a problem. But 5s and 3s with 140 and 150, like it's nasty work, So I found sets of 8 were far better for me, and they allowed me to build the strength. While single work kept my top end strength still pretty good and kept my body stable enough to do the benches. So the last time that I benched 170, I actually peaked that off a 130 for 8. The last time I benched 180, I peaked that off a 140 for 8. At that stage, I had already built up the ligament strength and the confidence to handle those types of weights. So I didn't need to really go down to the 5s and 3s. I mean, I do sometimes wonder whether I even needed the 5s and 3s the first as I was building up to those points. I don't know. But that's what I did. So, we can't go back in time and investigate these things. But the first time I built up to those ranges, it worked very well. 5s and 3s worked great. But as I got older and my joints started to get a bit beat up, the 5s and 3s, they worked fine, but they were just very, very hard to recover from. So it limited my overall work. So I found myself moving more towards the top singles, which was still fine. Single rep work has always been fine for me. It's still fine now. And then the 8s. And that was ultimately what was the best sort of compromise between what I was doing. So yeah, that's what kind of changed years later. I mean, take from that what you will in terms of your own training. You could argue and say, well, you're a bit older now. So for you guys who are watching who are a bit older, you might say, well, you're a bit older. So yeah, you want to stick to 8s. But then also, have you ever lifted those kind of weights? Has your body taken that level of beating? I don't know. So it's not always a clear-cut answer unless you've been in somebody's shoes. So take from that what you will. But if something resonates, then great. But I guess don't automatically assume that you don't need the 5s and 3s. They worked, and they worked really well. But to get back into ground, which I'd already covered before, I didn't need those. There you go. All right. So yeah, hopefully you guys found that interesting. That was basically kind of chronicling my journey from, I would say, roughly advanced strength level, so like 140 to 150 bench, to, I don't know, I wouldn't say elite levels, but decent levels, 170 to 180 bench, or like 375 to 400. So that was the journey I took. It needed, I would say the common strands were more frequency, okay, 3 up times a week, more volume as a result of the higher frequency, and more of a range of work, more top end work. So single repetition work, overload work, as well as more repetition work in general. So in the 8 range, those are sort of the common strands. I don't really think the light day gave me a great deal, to be honest. I don't think it did much. I never felt at the time it did a great deal. I think it was more just a break from the heavy days. Potentially that could have been just a much lighter day, maybe gone down to 30%, and it would have looked more like my light day, my wizard routine. I don't know. But, that's what I did. So cool. I'm going to call it there, and I will speak to you guys soon. I hopefully you found that useful, and take care.